Good evening, everyone. Welcome to UpStart Live, all about ESOPs. I'm Mansa, I'm your host for the evening. Today's session is around ESOPs, as the topic suggests. So, UpStart is a session that we do for startup entrepreneurs, where we bring in subject matter experts, founders, etc., like Pavan here, to talk about various topics, right? This could be regarding daily operation, marketing, sales, product, etc., and a little additional information around certain topics that actually interest the audience or startup founders. So today's session is on ESOPs, and Pavan is going to take us through a few questions and all about ESOPs that we can ask and get more information on. So if you have any questions for him right now before we go in, you can please drop your questions at the beginning itself of the session. I have a few questions for Pavan, which I'll be asking him, but you can also drop your questions and we will pick that up, and Pavan will answer that for you. We have an hour to go for the session, and before that, wherever your question comes in, we will be more than happy to pick it up. So thank you once again, Pavan, for being a part of this. A little introduction about you before we go into the questions.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Mansa. So I'm a CA by profession. I run a firm called BCL India. We are based out of 3 locations in India. We also have a company in the UAE. I handle basically the advisory side of our business. And yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you so much. To everybody's knowledge, Pavan has been our speaker in the past. Like he said, he's the partner at BCL India. So we bring him in for a lot of legal and advisory related information because we know he comes from that subject, that expertise in the subject. So yes, Pavan, without further delay, I'm going to dive right into the questions. This is from an employee as well as an employer point of view, right? That is the sort of, I want to set that context for our audience here. We are doing that today. So please tell me how ESOPs are beneficial for the employer. We all know about the employee, and obviously I'll ask you to cover that as well. But can we start off with the employer?
For sure. So ESOPs, as you know, are an incentive that the employer provides to employees. And the reason why we call it an incentive is because it helps the employer retain good talent. Now, there are 2 objectives of ESOPs. One, of course, is to retain good talent and also to hire good talent, right? So, in case the employer, which usually happens in the case of startups, are not able to compensate the employee for skills in the terms of cash, the employer may compensate the employee through shares. Now, the reason why shares make a lot of sense is because it aligns with the growth objective of the company, correct? Now, both the employer and the employee will be contributing for the growth of the company, of the startup, or any business for that matter. And because the goals are aligned, the chances that the outcome are positive increase, right? So now, when the employer compensates the employee in the form of shares, the employee knows that if I work hard, if I contribute to the organization, there are chances that the company does well, there's growth in value of the company, and now I get to participate in that value growth, value creation, which is why ESOPs are a good compensation scheme from an employer's perspective too, right? So the employer would not have been able to acquire that talent or hire or retain that talent if it was not for ESOPs, right? Now you'd see increasingly startups offering ESOPs to its employees because you would also see in the news that a lot of these employees were part of large startups in its early days, have been rewarded handsomely, and from an employer's perspective, to reach that stage would have been possible only with the help of these employees.
Absolutely, Pavan. Should an employee, if it is always a choice, right? And should an employee opt for any ESOP schemes as such?
It is ideal that the employee opts for a scheme. Opts meaning, so their opt into an ESOP scheme has 2 connotations. One, of course, is does the employee have access to the ESOP scheme? Second, can the employee exercise that option and eventually get shares? So, as far as the granting of options itself, that's the decision of the employer. And as part of the offer letter, in case the employer suggests to the employee that you'd be able to participate in an ESOP scheme, it makes sense for the employee to accept that offer. As far as the as far as the second portion is concerned, which is the exercise of option itself, exercising is left to the employee because there's also a tax aspect to it. So as long as the employee believes that the tax burden can be met, exercising would make sense because that would make you the owner of the company. So both perspectives, be it access to the ESOPs as part of the grant or offer letter, and exercising it when the vesting is complete, depend on these factors.
Pavan, you spoke about tax burden and something like that, right? Can you talk about the tax implications of ESOPs on an employee? What it is?
Sure. So there are two tax implications. The first one is at the time of exercising the options. When the employee exercises the option, the employee ends up paying a perquisite tax or a salary tax. Now, this perquisite tax is taxed under the head income from salaries. The value of the perquisite is equal to the fair market value of the ESOPs or the shares actually on the date of exercise minus the exercise price. Exercise price is the money that the employee pays to buy these shares. Now that difference is taxable under the head salaries. This is the first piece. The second is when the employee sells these shares, because now the employee is a shareholder, is an owner of these shares. The employee will end up paying capital gains tax on the difference between the sale value and the fair market value on which the employee had originally paid the perquisite tax. So two types of tax: salary and capital gains.
So Karthik asked a question. For exercising the ESOPs, does the employee need to pay the amount as per the amount? I don't know what as per
Um,
amount means.
I'm guessing what he means is, does the employee have to pay anything? The
Anything,
employee will
yeah.
have Normally the employee has to pay a price which is called the exercise price. It's also called strike price, and that's the compensation the employee will have to pay. Money employee has to put on the table to be eligible to get the shares. Now there are three steps, so to say, in ESOPs. First is grant, second is vesting, and third is exercise. So the time of grant, normally there's no price attached. So the employer usually grants these options without charging any option price. Now, vesting happens based on milestones, so there's no price there. But at the time of exercise, which is the third step, the employee is required to pay an exercise price. So usually this is equal to the face value of the shares. In rare cases, it is less than the face value itself. Sometimes it could be more. So there is a price payable in it.
Got it. So, while we spoke about the tax implications for the employee, right? What about is it a tax burden or a relief for the employer, Pavan, when it comes to giving off ESOPs? I do understand the like relief on the part of the salary paid to the employee, but what about the implications of tax again for them? Is it a relief or is it a burden?
Tax, it's neither of them, it's an obligation. Right now the employee is obliged to pay this tax. Now the amount of tax that the employee has to pay is deducted from the employee's salary. Sometimes the employee's salary is insufficient to pay this tax because the value of ESOPs may be significantly high. So when the tax amount exceeds the salary that the employee is earning, you cannot send the employee home without any compensation. So the option that's given under most ESOP plans is that the employee can pay the tax directly. Of course, you'll have to route it through the employer's tax deduction number. But if the employee is able to bear the tax burden, the employee is free to exercise the shares. Otherwise, it is best that the employee waits till such time these options can be converted to shares and the shares can be converted into money, which usually is a liquidation event.
Got it. So, another question from Ramveer. Is ESOP issued against the salary payable to the employee?
So ESOP is actually part of your salary. It's part of your compensation plan. So it'll have two parts. One is the cash compensation. The second is the stock compensation. Stock compensation is your ESOP. So your effective CTC is split between these two parts. So you can use shares to compensate the employee against salaries that are paid. But to go strictly by the language, if salary is payable to the employee, it's usually in the form of cash. Now, that cash compensation that is payable to the employee cannot be replaced by stock. There is a way by which you can issue shares against the liabilities under the company law, but it's a much longer convoluted route. It does not fall under the head of ESOPs.
Sure. So, can the employee of a startup company trade their shares in the market? How does that work?
Startups are unlisted companies, which means they're privately held, closely held. Their shares are not tradable in the market. So, which means that employees of startups cannot sell their shares to the outside world without the approval of the board. So, the first persons to whom that they can sell these shares are the existing shareholders. That's by design. And in case the company permits, you can sell these shares to a third party. Of course, sometimes investors, existing shareholders, have the right of first refusal, which means that even if the employee goes out, finds a buyer, the employee will have to offer these shares for sale to existing shareholders at the same terms. So it's not very easy for employees of startups to sell their shares in the outside market.
Got it, Pavan. So there are various terms, right? Like when we talk about ESOPs, exercise period, vesting period. Can you help us understand how this works and what they mean in the first place? How the ESOP mechanism actually works? How does that go about? Plus, what these terms mean. A lot of terms we get to hear when we are talking about all this.
Sure. So let's split this into three parts, like I mentioned. The first is grant, the second is vesting, and the third is exercise. Grant is basically an offer made by the employer to the employee of the eligibility, saying how many options you'd be eligible to, how many shares would those options convert into, and that is by way of a grant letter. So once the grant is formalized by way of a grant letter, the employee will have to satisfy certain conditions. Those conditions could be either linked to time, number of years that the employee would complete in a company, or could be linked to milestones, which could be sales based milestone, profitability, branch level results, so on and so forth. The employer is free to design stock option plans that suit the employer's requirements. So if the employee satisfies these vesting conditions, the employee is now eligible to exercise the options. Now, exercise is the third stage. Exercise basically means that now I have a right to buy the shares that are underlying these options. To exercise the shares, the employee has to pay a price, which is called the exercise price. Now, there's also a concept of fair market value, which is the price of the shares as on the date of exercise. So, the benefit that accrues to the employee is the difference between that fair market value and the price the employee pays, which is the exercise price. So, that's the benefit. And that's the same benefit that is subject to tax under the salary head as perquisite.
Got it, Pawan. So, is there a mandatory, like a vesting period that is mandated by law? Is there like a that vesting period? Is it a certain
There
amount
is
and it is mandated?
there is one period that's mentioned under the company law, which is the first year. So you cannot exercise those shares within. We cannot exercise the option within 1 year of grant. Other than that, the employer is free to set an exercise period or a vesting period that is suitable for their employees.
Got it. So this is slightly a longer question. I'm not sure if you can see this, but if you can, you
Let
might
me
follow
describe
it.
that.
Yeah. Karthik's question.
So yes, at the end of each year, the employee would be eligible to 25% of the stock options. So if you look at the question, it is ESOPs worth 5 lakhs over 4 years, so 1.25 lakhs per annum. So at the end of each year, the employee now has access to stocks worth 1.25 lakhs. Now, of course, the employee is free to exercise the options and get shares worth 1.25 lakhs at the end of the same year. Or if need be, the employee could accumulate and exercise at the end of the second year. Second year, the employee could to exercise options for 2.5 lakhs altogether, right? So that options left to the employee.
Okay, so there is another question: how to calculate fair market value for a newly established startup?
So valuations normally done using the discounted cash flow principle. The authority who can issue a certificate under the income tax law is the merchant banker. So the merchant banker issues a certificate which mentions what the price is. Now that drives the exercise, like that drives the perquisite valuation. But at the end of each year, or usually during the financial year on the grant date, the company also has to ascertain the value of stock options cost, which go into the PL, and that number can be determined either by a CA or a registered value or even a merchant banker.
Sure. So, is it mandatory for startups to have an ESOP policy? I think this is in everybody's mind. Is it mandatory?
No, not at all. So ESOP is optional. the employer is free to design the ESOP policy. The employer is free to even elect to have an ESOP policy or otherwise. Nowadays, a lot of startups are choosing to do so, but there's no compulsion.
Got it. So, while drafting the ESOP policy, are there key points to be kept in mind? If so, what are they?
So some of the key points are to do with the vesting itself, the vesting period, and the way you design the vesting period. Now, it could either be a straight, clean vesting, which is 25% each. For example, like the question that we just got. You can also have a graded vesting scheme where the number of ESOPs that the employee is eligible for increases year on year. The second part is with respect to the exercise price itself. We also have the exercise period, which is the period after the vesting is complete, up to the point where the employee is eligible to exercise these shares. We also have to consider the tax aspects linked to it. So we usually connect the tax or the exercise to a liquidity event, which is when the shares can get converted to cash. You also have the issue of the employee resigning and what happens to stock options that have vested, stock options that have not vested. How do you deal with options that have been exercised? Say the employee has these shares, and you also have cases of a good leaver or employees who leave for cause, employees whose contract is terminated for fraud, misconduct. How do you treat those cases? So there are quite a few complicated aspects that can be covered in an ESOP scheme to make sure these questions are answered. Otherwise, it may lead to disputes between the employee and the employer.
Absolutely. Pavan, who frames these? Who frames this? Is it the company that frames it, and do they have to get it sort of vouched by somebody else? How does that? What happens there?
So normally, a company takes the help of some expert, which could be a CA, company secretary, a lawyer, to draft the ESOP policies. The employer may also draft the policy internally. The employer may have enough number of skilled persons to draft the policy internally. Now, once the policy is drafted, it needs to be approved by the shareholders. You need a special resolution. And once that's in place, the policy is formalized and the employees would be able to access the options.
Got it. So, what is the difference between these stock options and RSUs, the restricted stock units? Is it? Yeah. So,
Uh,
how are they different, Pavan? Just
So, as
wanting
the
to.
name suggests, RSUs or restricted stock units, there are restrictions with respect to dividend rights, voting rights. RSU is not a concept that's common in India. It's usually used outside India. In India, you have the concept of ESOPs, where once the employee exercises the stock options, the employee is a shareholder. As a shareholder, the employee gets rights, which are dividend rights, voting rights. So there are no restrictions attached to ESOPs.
So, RSUs is rather restricted, while ESOPs is not. ESOPs are not.
That is
Got
correct.
it. What if we had this? We covered this in the key points, that this would be one of the key points. So, what if an employee leaves right during the vesting period? What happens then? Can they still exercise the option?
If the employee leaves during the vesting period, the employee would not be able to exercise because the vesting itself is not complete, correct? So the employee would be able to exercise these options only after the vesting is complete. Now, if the employee leaves also after the vesting is complete, some companies allow employees to exercise the options before they leave or within a period of 12 months after their exit. Some employees have a restriction saying that the employee would not be able to exercise these options if they leave, right? So it depends on the policy.
Got it. So, another question from Karthik: is the vesting price and exercise price the same?
There's no vesting price. The only price that you have is the exercise price, which
Hmm.
is payable to buy the stock options, or rather shares, not stock options.
Yeah, got it. So, let's say few options are exercised and the employee leaves the startup. What is the action plan then? What about the rest of them? What happens?
So if say the employee leaves the company, the employee has certain options that have. So there are two categories. Options could have been vested. Options are not vested. If the options are not vested, they lapse. Simply lapse, right? If the options are vested, the employer can give the employee an opportunity to exercise those options before the employee leaves, or give an extended time period. And if the employee does not exercise the options within that extended time period as well, then those options will lapse, right? So lapse meaning the employee cannot opt in or cannot exercise those options.
Got it. So, what are the tax implications for a employer in this case? Like, are there anything that they take care of, thing to do with tax in the case of ESOPs?
Not the employer. There are no tax. There's no tax payable by the employer because the employer is offering a compensation to the employee. Tax is payable by the employee, and that's under the head of salary, as we have discussed. Nothing from the employer side. Of course, the employer is under obligation to deduct taxes on the compensation given to the employee, and the tax that is being deducted is again depends on whether the employee has sufficient cash compensation, right, to deduct that amount.
Got
So
it,
the other
Pavan.
question is, sorry, I'll just take that question.
Yeah, please.
Employee can choose not to exercise in the first year and can exercise. The employee is free to exercise the options anytime. The employee may choose not to exercise it in the first year. He can exercise it any point after the vesting is complete. There's the benefit actually depends on the ability of the employee to pay the tax, right? So, say salary increases with time, so which means that the employee has enough salary for the employer to deduct and pay tax. Second, of course, is that the value keeps growing, so it makes sense for the employee to be clear in the employee's own mind whether it's worthwhile to invest in this company, worthwhile to exercise my options, suffer the tax cost, and I know for sure that the company is doing well, so I can always convert that to cash.
Absolutely. I think that makes sense. Pavan, I have finished off with my questions. I'm waiting for the audience. Anything from that you think we can add to the audience here, basis the questions that we have been getting? Anything of use to the audience here?
Yeah, we've pretty much covered everything in our conversation. We'll just wait for a couple of minutes to see if there are questions.
Yes, sure. Okay, one more. What happens to these ESOPs when a company goes for IPO? Does anything change? Is that when the value becomes higher? What happens there?
Uh, when the company goes public, then the employee has the option now to sell the shares. So the marketability of the shares will improve, right? So of course the value, because the marketability improves, the value also improves, right? So that way it is helpful. So we have a question: if the ESOPs are allotted over 4 years, do they have to be on the same value, or can it be? Interesting question. I've normally seen the exercise price to be the same, irrespective of when the employee exercises the option. But I don't see any restriction as far as the year is concerned. So maybe the employer has an option to increase the price year on year. So the exercise price increases, and it's a little more expensive for employees to buy into the uh, ESOP scheme, right? Usually, employers may not do that because it may dissuade employees from exercising options in the third or fourth year, which is when they actually get value out of the stock option plan.
Understood, Pawan. So here it doesn't really matter. Doesn't really matter how the price of like now the currency changes anything, right? Because we are not selling it out. It's just they are that they are exercising. So that's about it. Should be okay. Is that how it is?
Actually, currency fluctuations have no impact. It's all in INR. Of course, if the employee is exercising a stock option plan of a holding company outside India, then yes, exchange fluctuation will make a difference. Otherwise, no.
Sure. I think that's about it, Pavan. No more questions. This was a short session, but a very impactful session. Um, we'll just okay. Yeah, I think we are okay. In case we get a question now, before from now to the end of the session, we can just cover it. Thank you
Sure.
so much to the audience for joining us. We wanted to try a different timing, and I think it really helped because we see a lot of people coming in only later in the day. So we just wanted to do it at a different time. And thank you, Pavan, as always, for being a part of the session. We'll see you at our next session. We keep having these events every week. So please join us on the next one. And Pavan, we look forward to hosting you again. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Good evening. Bye.
Thank you.